you may know, you will have seen him on the podcast circuit, Rob Henderson.
Yes,
Henderson.
I was listening to him last night on Chris Williams.
A brilliant guy, the coiner
So
of the
good.
phrase luxury beliefs. And there's an additional take I'll have on that, which is that people
Sorry, just quickly,
increasingly...
could you define?
Yes, I ought to explain this. So Rob's thesis, he grew up in foster homes in Los Angeles. He's just published a book, which I really recommend. It's actually a bestseller in the US already, called Troubled, about his childhood. And he effectively had I think has only a couple of memories of his mother. Don't think he ever knew his biological father. Ended up being fostered, and fostered in turn in a slightly dysfunctional home. And I think, Rob would probably agree when I said that he got his shit together by joining the USAF to some extent, and then ended up going to Yale and then on
USAF
to Cambridge.
Air Force.
US Air Force.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting points of the book is that the stability of your home background has a bigger determinant on your future success. This is not, by the way, I want to be absolutely clear about this. This isn't destiny, okay? It's simply statistics. But if you look at statistics, then generally people's life outcomes are more predicated on the kind of stability of their family background than on family wealth or on education. And yet, what Rob noticed is that when he got to Yale, it was fashionable to say, I think marriage is just a social construct, and, I think people should be free to, live in, open partnerships with, polyamory and so on, Now, those people themselves didn't actually adopt those behaviors, but it was fashionable to advocate for them.
Yeah.
And he argued that this was, and he coined the phrase effectively, fashionable beliefs, in that there were beliefs that people held not because they really believed in them or that there was empirical evidence that these beliefs were indeed true or useful, but simply because it raised your status holding that belief.
Wow. Yeah.
There are certain beliefs. It's very interesting. If you talk, for example, on the question of cannabis legalization, okay? Yeah. Now, by definition, if you've got into Yale, okay, you're probably not a stoner and you don't have a major problem with drugs. Because if you did have a major problem with drugs, you probably wouldn't have got there. But it's very fashionable for people who've got there who don't have a problem to go, it should all be decriminalized and blah, blah, blah. Simply because that's a belief which has become almost arbitrarily fashionable. And so you cleave to the beliefs that high status people tend to have, regardless of anything else, simply because they make you look good and feel good.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting to me is that to some extent the political left might have taken a wrong turn here, because if your principal motivation is the redistribution of wealth and resources, okay, there are ways psychologically where you can get rich people to give their money to poorer people and still feel good about it, okay? There are all sorts of psychological tricks. I mean, that's philanthropy, after all. That's the Gates Foundation at an extreme level, but it's also paying tax, paying duties. Airlines have worked out ways in which rich people pay considerably more to fly to the same destination than poor people. There are lots of ways in which you can separate the wealthy from their money without making them feel bad. But there's no way you can remove someone's or reduce someone's status and still leave them feeling better. That mechanism just doesn't exist, in my opinion. So by turning politics into a status war between tribes, where each group seeks in many ways to essentially promote policies and beliefs which make their own group look and feel good, and which perhaps demonstrate their commitment to a group that holds those beliefs, and thereby diminishing the status of people who disagree with you, you'll never change anybody's mind. Now, if you look at advertising, you can look at all the world's advertising. You will not see a single, for example, advertisement from Ford going, if you drive a GM car, you're a moron. Okay. Now, I'm sure it's been tried. In fact, I know it was tried, but I think it never ran. It was in the very late days of Bill Bernbach, I think, where they kind of showed monkeys drinking other brands of beer. And that was an ad which Bernbach himself killed, because he said, what we're trying to do is to win over our competitors' drinkers, and you're portraying them as apes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can't change people's minds by diminishing their status. Okay, I mean, the least persuasive message you can possibly construct is effectively, I am right and you're wrong, you dumb piece of shit. Okay, it's not persuasive. In many ways, if you want to persuade people, you do the opposite. You practice flattery, or you do things that elevate their status or make them feel good about doing something. And as I said, you can make people feel good about surrendering money and resources and time. Okay, and all sorts of voluntary activity goes on in life. We've got evolutionary mechanisms for that. What we haven't got, as far as I can see, is any evolutionary mechanism by which I can actually reduce my status and feel good about it.
Have you heard of Will Storr's status game?
Yeah, I've read it. It's fantastic.
I've the science of storytelling. The status game has
and his point is absolutely fair, which is that this is where, of course, great restaurants aren't always about food.
Oh, 100%.
Okay, it's about, particularly in places like New York. I find it a bit irritating in New York. You say, where are you going this evening? You name the restaurant. They go, oh, that was so last year. And you go, well, is the food any good? Because I'm not really interested in whether it's last year or this year. But you have this kind of weird I guess it's a positive feedback effect where places just become hyper fashionable for a time and then basically hit a peak and fall off. I think London and the UK is less guilty of that. Generally, a good restaurant can remain a good restaurant for decades much more easily here.
I think social media is what pulls gasoline on the status and the beginnings of the status fire, because it's like, I think what Will Storr
actually, when I said, I think I said fashionable beliefs, he actually calls them luxury beliefs.
Luxury beliefs, fashionable beliefs, luxury beliefs.
Yeah.
But I think putting this again into kind of food and drink, the ultimate, as you said, you can't say you buy a Ford because you're a fucking moron. Yeah. But where I think this has almost gone to the next level is, those vegan meat brands.
Yes.
Who have their way of almost saying it is, we're going to we're not going to be like tofu or like tofu. What's the other one? Tempeh, which is like a kind of.
I know exactly.
Do you know exactly what it is?
Yeah.
They're going to say we are in terms of this binary piece we were talking about earlier. It's like we are bacon. We are, and it's almost saying
you had of course the brand which I think is now owned by Unilever called the Vegetarian Butcher. Yeah. You had a brilliant branding effort in Beyond Meat, which was effectively saying this isn't a compromise, this isn't actually a substitute for meat, it's actually meatier than meat itself.
Yeah.
And that's a very clever branding. In a sense, Tesla very cleverly did it with electric cars because it had always been assumed that an electric car was a kind of compromise. That it was slower, it had lower range, that's kind of inevitable, at least at this stage. But, it had, that you bought an electric car entirely as an act of self-sacrifice to benefit the planet. And Tesla comes along with a car which is basically a saloon car which has the performance of a supercar.
Yeah.
Okay, literally it squares the circle, if you like. It actually says this isn't a contradiction at all. There's actually no compromise required when you have an electric car. You can have an electric car which is a better car. But that question of turning politics into a status game where you seek to demean, for example, calling people racist for things which are not remotely evidence of racism on the part of the person using the language, for instance. Particularly some of that status game, I think, is evidenced by people taking up arms on behalf of minority groups rather than actually letting the minority groups speak for themselves. I find something creepy about that.
Well, that's
I want to hear from trans people. I don't want to hear from a bunch of political activists affecting to speak on behalf of the trans community. I want trans voices on the TV talking about their own personal experience. Okay. And so when you have those people who essentially take up a kind of white savior approach, that's a status game. That's a luxury belief going on there. Now, it happens on the other side as well. I'm not suggesting this isn't in any way one-sided. What I'm saying is that there is no real form of persuasion that's effective that is preceded by the humiliation of the person you're trying to persuade.
Espressos is sponsored by supply chain software gurus Unleashed. It talks your e-com and accounting software. It's helped islands cut admin time in half, get granular clarity on your margins, know where your stock is, don't miss availability. Brands like Candy Kittens, Tiny Rebel and Trip all use Unleashed, and so should you.